The reading today is taken from Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 to 30. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12 disciples, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." He answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's great to see you here. Thank you for coming. I guess I regard myself as fortunate in lots and lots of ways. And one of those ways is that I can't recall ever being betrayed. I've been let down on occasion, but never betrayed. And there is an enormous difference between the two. We let people down and we let God down because we are imperfect people. We are sometimes weak, sometimes selfish, actually quite often selfish, if I'm talking personally. Sometimes fearful, and sometimes simply out of our depths. But betrayal is willful and deliberate. It is about choosing to be disloyal to someone who has loved you or trusted you or invested in you. And I know that some of you, many of you maybe know that experience. And that sense of being betrayed can have a deep psychological effect, can't it? Grief, doubt, self-esteem getting damaged. I've read some testimonies of people who've been betrayed during the week, and I was struck by this description. It feels like shock and hurt and anger, rushing hot blood coursing through you with pressure, filling your head as your eyes brim with burning tears. A lump in your throat forms, rendering you unable to convey the level of betrayal. And it struck me reading today's reading that as we read through, Jesus was experiencing all of that. You wouldn't maybe know it, but that's Jesus is going through that as we follow our reading today. And of course, the name Judas has become a watchword for betrayal. When we hear the word Judas, we think betrayal. And we regard those who betray their communities, or in this case their football team, by going to the competitors as modern-day Judases. If the unnamed woman from last week's story is remembered with honour whenever her story is recounted, Judas is regarded with dishonour. The story of Judas appears in all four of the Gospels. Like the anointing story that Charlie was unpacking last week, each Gospel has a separate take on the stories, different details, different bits included. And Charlie pointed this out last week. The temptation is when we have four Gospels with different bits, we try and bring them all together and merge them in one kind of story to harmonise them, to bring them together, rather than to take each story on its own merits. God has given us four separate Gospels, each with their own contribution, and it's good to take them in that way rather than to try and bring them all together. So we read, when one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. I guess maybe the first thing we should note is that it's an ugly tale, isn't it? An ugly tale of treachery, of sordid bargaining. It follows immediately after that story we were looking at last week, of the unnamed woman who poured a ridiculously expensive bottle of perfume over Jesus' head. An act of extravagance, of beauty, of devotion, of love. Anointing Jesus as king, but also as a preparation for his death. As I say, it's a story of love and devotion and extravagance, which makes Judas appear even smaller. And I believe that Matthew's actually put those two stories together because he wants us to note the contrast. And if you didn't hear last week's sermon, it's still on YouTube or on the pod, and you can catch up. It's well worth listening to. But these two stories kind of stand together, almost in opposition to each other. One of the questions people often ask is why did Judas do this? What happened to Judas? What was it that brought him to this point? And over the years, all sorts of answers have been suggested. He's been accused of deceit, of jealousy, of ambition, of fear, and assorted other things. Well, the most common answer simply is that Judas was greedy. And if you read John's Gospel, it does seem to support that accusation. But we're in Matthew. And Matthew doesn't actually attribute any of those things to Judas. And actually, I'm quite glad of that, because which one of us is completely free from greed or jealousy or ambition or fear? We know those things in our own hearts. We, like Judas, are complex people. And our motivations can be equally complex. And it's good to recognize that. It's good to acknowledge that. But what about that fee of 30 pieces of silver? Isn't that proof of Judas's greed? Well, perhaps. But actually, as I read Matthew's Gospel, it feels more the case that actually Judas decided to betray Jesus and then looked for a way to make a bit of money out of it. The money wasn't the motivation, but if there was some money on offer, I'm going to grab a piece of it. Monetizing things, we're good at that these days. What can we monetize? Judas wanted to monetize his betrayal of Jesus. Although 30 pieces of silver does sound rather a lot, doesn't it? I don't know how much you imagine in your mind when you think of 30 pieces of silver. Actually, it was equivalent to about a month's work for a labourer. So not inconsequential, but well, in the Old Testament, it's the value of compensation set for the loss of a slave. Is that what Jesus is worth? In Zechariah, it's the wages paid by bad masters to a good shepherd. For Jesus, the good shepherd, the servant of God, the chief priests, offer the same number of silver pieces. 30 pieces of silver is meant to be an insult. It's a pittance, particularly when you compare it with the alabaster jar full of perfume. It reveals the utter spiritual blindness of those who would oppose Jesus, who thought that's what he was worth. But back to Judas. In the beginning, when Jesus first appeared, Judas left everything to follow him. He was convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, the one who would give Rome an almighty beating, who would cleanse the religious hierarchy, clearing out those who had sold the nation out. He was convinced that he was the one who would establish God's kingdom, God's righteous kingdom here on earth. He would rule the world from Jerusalem, establishing Israel as top dog. Judas was zealous in his faith. He was passionate about that vision for the future. But over time, doubts set in, and he found himself becoming increasingly disillusioned with Jesus. Maybe that's normal. Maybe many of us have been there at times where we feel just disillusioned with God, disillusioned with Jesus. And I suspect that for Judas, the perfume was the straw that broke the camel's back. What a waste. Just think of all the good that money could have done. Judas had a preconceived notion of what a Messiah should be like. And Jesus didn't fit that notion. Jesus knew how the kingdom should play out. He was sure he understood Jesus' mission better than Jesus himself. In fact, he did not very much like Jesus' way of being Messiah. He didn't want that kind of Messiah. He wanted an all-conquering hero, thank you very much. And at the end of the day, he was not willing to allow Jesus to reshape his idea of what God was like and what God's kingdom was like. He wanted Jesus to join his crusade rather than him joining Jesus's. Sometimes the things that we are most passionate about are the things that bring us down, because the outcome becomes the only thing that is important. The end justifies the means. and those who disagree with us become the bad guys. Actually, I think Jesus is usually more interested in the means than the end. He is more interested in the people that we are becoming rather than our achievements. In church life, we can become so concerned about theological purity or even behavioural purity that we push out those who don't meet our own expectations. The expectations we put on others about how they are to think or to behave or bring up their children, and things like that can become toxic. I was hearing some stories in the week of parents whose relationship with their kids was ruined because of the expectations of the church and what kind of parents they should be and what was allowable and what wasn't. What if there are no good guys or bad guys? Just people. Judas wanted to be in control because he knew best. And maybe that's where my life and Judas's intersect. I regularly think that I know what's best for me and for my life and how the world should unfold, how the world should be. And when things don't go according to plan, to my plan, I am easily frustrated, disappointed, angry, tempted to despair. Maybe that's one of the central causes of sin. We're confident that we know better, even than God himself. And we want to have our own way, rather than doing it God's way, yielding to God's vision, God's mission. We set our own course. It's now evening, and it's time for the Passover meal. Passover is that great memorial meal when Israel remembers how God liberated them from slavery in Egypt. It is where they celebrate that wonderful act of salvation and how God has united them as a single people to serve God, to be his presence in the world. But this evening, the discussion is not about any of that. The meal is dominated by discussions of loyalty and betrayal. Of course, we know that Judas is the betrayer, but the disciples don't. The other disciples don't know that. And those words from Jesus that one of you is going to betray me, I wonder how that made them feel. Is it me? Am I going to do something? It couldn't be me. Which one of these guys is it? They kind of began to look round suspiciously. I wonder who it is. But Jesus is not telling. Instead, he says this: woe to the one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. To say woe to is the opposite of saying blessed are. They kind of stand in, not opposition as such, but they stand together in the Bible. They're both sort of formulaic sayings. Blessed are the poor in spirit, we heard Jesus saying earlier. Blessings are announced on those who align themselves with God and his purposes. Those who are doing God's will, those who are following Jesus, those who are doing things God's way, there is a blessing, Jesus says. Woe to the one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Woes are pronounced on those who set themselves against God. They have resisted the love and the grace of God. The words maybe sound harsh, but I suspect the words were spoken with a tear in Jesus' eye. He said to Judas, "This is what you've chosen." Not word of condemnation as such, but simply that statement of fact, this is what you have chosen. Incidentally, I think there's a difference between Judas and the other disciples. Of course, they all fell away. They all let Jesus down. Peter and the rest of the disciples, I suspect, were out of their depth most of the time. All this stuff happening, and they really did not get it. If you read through the gospel accounts, in our home group, we've been reading through Mark, and that's one of the things that struck us time and time again. The disciples just, maybe like when you hear the sermon. And whilst they were no strangers to greed, to jealousy, to ambition, and yes, to fear, and whilst they may have deserted Jesus, they never set out to work against Jesus, unlike Judas. In their hearts, they remained loyal, even when the flesh was weak. They never switched sides. It is quite possible to let Jesus down and yet to remain loyal to him. We all know that, don't we? If we're honest. We've let Jesus down. All of us, I have. But we remain loyal, don't we? Just like the disciples. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it. And he gave it to the disciples. And he said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup. And after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, you will never again drink the fruit of this vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." One author translates those words as, "Father, if I must die, let my death be like the death of the grain of wheat and the bunch of grapes." It is profound and mysterious language. And you know what? I'm pretty sure that every word went straight over the disciples' head. The words, the imagery would have been shocking to them. And they did not get what was going on. I sometimes wonder whether those disciples shared communion on Holy Saturday between the crucifixion and the resurrection, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, trying to find comfort in these words and actions. I wonder what it was like the first time the disciples shared communion after the resurrection. How different that must have felt. That must have been some occasion. And maybe at that point, they started to make the connections. Suddenly things started to become clear. So, that sort of eureka. Suddenly the jigsaw began to fall into place a bit. there are a couple of questions that run through each of the gospel, including Matthew's. Who is Jesus is one. Or more specifically, is Jesus the Messiah, the King? You may have noticed that question as we've been working through Matthew's gospel. What kind of king? What kind of kingdom? The author Stanley Saunders argues that the Lord's table, that this table that we gather around, where we're going to shortly share bread and wine, he says that it's a counter-ritual. A counter-ritual to the liturgies of violence and war and terror that continue to beset the world. What he means is that while the world continues to celebrate military success, while the world fates the beautiful, while the world honours the rich and the famous, Jesus wants us to remember him in this way. His body broken, his blood poured out on a cross. The cross was not just a terrible way to die. The whole ritual was designed not simply to kill you, but to dehumanize you. It was demeaning and degrading, and the message that it was intended to send was that this person was a worthless scum, not fit to be called a human being. And yet this is how Jesus would have us remember him. Because this is how those questions are answered. And this is how God's love wins. In death, on a cross. The worst death just about imaginable. Like the disciples, I wonder whether these communion words go right over my head at times. I've been following Jesus for 40 years, and I'm still learning what they mean. Still discovering their depth, their riches. Maybe I'm just a slow learner. Or maybe this meal is just so rich and profound that we never fully get a hold of what is going on. It will remain a mystery. What I do know from experience is that in this mystery we meet with God, or rather God meets with us. We encounter God here at this table. He is as present here in a sense as he was that very first meal. And this meal is intensely personal. Broken for me. Broken for you. Poured out for me. Poured out for you. For my forgiveness. For your forgiveness. For my salvation. For your salvation. Words spoken to disciples who had already let Jesus down and who would again let Jesus down. Words spoken to Judas, who was still there. Imagine Jesus' pain as he looked round the table and saw Judas there, and yet still he spoke those words. Still he offered bread and wine. What hope is there for Judas? What hope is there for any of us? Well, we are here. We are called by God's love and invited to eat and drink, whoever we are, whatever we have done. Invited to eat and drink, and once again to accept Christ, to follow Jesus. But maybe there's an important word here also for the church. I wonder when Jesus said, "This is my body," that he looked not just at the bread, but he looked around him, at the disciples. This is my body. You are my body. That's what we call the church, isn't it? The body of Christ. You are my body. Together. You too will be broken again and again for the sake of the world. And this is how you are to be in the world, like I was in the world. Never forget that. This is how God heals the world. The world plays its own power games. The world seeks to manipulate and dominate and get its own way. That is the way of Judas. And too often Christians have behaved that way, thinking that they were acting for God, thinking that the end justifies the means. But God's power is power with, not power over. He is with us now. God's power is exercised through service, through giving, through loving, through sacrifice, through grace, through forgiveness. God's power confronts and transforms. Says to us, "This is my body, this is my blood." Says to us, "You are my body, and I want you to be in the world as I was in the world."